CCG 名家对话现在就要开始了，请大家把手机调到静音状态。Please take your mobile phone in silent mode. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and Professor Morris, good evening. Welcome to CCG. I'm Shirley Ren, Director of CCG Publishing Center. So welcome all today. It's our great honor to host this CCG Global Dialogue between Dr. Huiyao Wang and Professor Michael Morris with CITIC Press Group. And Dr. Wang is the founder and president of CCG. In 2021, he initiated CCG Global Dialogue, and up to date, he has dialogue with over 100 global top opinion leaders, including Graham Allison, Pascal Lamy, Martin Wolf, and Ray Dalio, to name just a few. So let's warmly welcome Dr. Wang to start the conversation with Professor Morris. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Shirley. Also, great welcome, Professor Morris, to join us. And as Shirley mentioned, we have this dialogue launched since actually COVID time, where people cannot really see each other. So we started this dialogue online, but then on and off, we have done over almost 100 global opinion leaders, former politicians, and of course, business leaders as well. So we are extremely pleased to welcome Professor Michael Morris to join us today. And I'd like to maybe briefly introduce Professor Morris. So Professor Michael Morris is a Kevin Chan Professor of Leadership at Columbia Business School, and also serve as a professor of psychology in the psychology department of Columbia University. So you teaches MBA and executive level classes of leadership, teamwork, communication, negotiation, and decision making. All those are very interesting areas. In 2016, you were honored with the Dean's Award for Innovation in the curricula for creating one of the school's most popular elective courses, the Leader's Voice, a class focused on the modes of leadership and communication. So I know that you have published 200 some articles in leading behavior science and management journals on topics such as decision making, social adjustment, negotiation, and social networks. So it's very fascinating to see all those interesting research on culture and cognition, which help to spark the growth of culture psychology and your more recent research triggering and the learning of cultural codes that help shift the field to more dynamic conception and cultural influence. So basically today we are going to talk about your book, the Tribal, which you argue that the leaders can harness the shared cultural identities to unify, mobilize groups of people to work together. So this is really fascinating. We have a group of audience here actually in the CCG conference room. We're pleased to welcome you all, but also welcome the audience online as well. So very pleased to have this CCG Global Dialogue. So I'd like to start with some questions, Professor Morris, if I may. And first, I want to cover, we are in a turbulent time. Particularly, you see there's a tribal instinct, which have you studied extensively. How can we maybe take advantage of to bridge the East and West? So the core argument you make in the tribal that culture is malleable, not a fixed destiny, is impressive and offers new hope for thinking about global cooperation, which is exactly what they needed in the world today. And so in this era of heightened tension between globalization and localization and fragmentation and prevalent narratives of geopolitical competition, how can we apply those wisdom of this cultural malleability to proactively shape more inclusive modes of international interaction rather than passively falling into a clash of civilization? So Michael, why don't you take a first introduction of the book, but also those questions.
Sure. Well, let me start by saying thank you for inviting me to this dialogue. It's a real honor to talk about these issues with someone who not only has worked on them in academia like I have, but you've also worked on them as a statesman, as an ambassador for research in the West and in China, and as someone bringing together think tanks in the two countries. I'm a big fan of track two diplomacy, and I admire the work that you've done to try to keep those lines of communication open. I really like your question. You make reference to the clash of civilization, to Samuel Huntington's idea that timeless civilizational cultures are going to be the site of the conflicts, in the future. That's what he thought after the Cold War. And now, Huntington is one of these people that's frustrating for me because he's partly right and partly wrong. He's right that culture matters. He's right that conflicts often turn on ideological rather than economic grounds, but he's wrong about the civilizational part, and he's wrong about the unchanging part. The part that these cultures are timeless and unchanging. He, was part of the old-fashioned political science when it was based on anecdotes, before it became quantitative and data-based. So political scientists who've tried to test his argument either by looking, before he wrote the book or after he wrote the book, are most of the conflicts in the world, or even the conflicts between states, are they mostly along the lines of these civilizations? And the answer is no. Most of them are within these civilizations. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine, it's the same part of Western civilization. And they're both Slavic nations with the same cultural roots. Sometimes it's the slight differences that lead to the biggest conflicts. When I was growing up, I'm Irish. I have a dual citizenship, and Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland were in bitter, bloody conflict, and even for people who live there, they can't physically distinguish. Or even talking to somebody for a while, it's hard to tell whether they're Catholic or Protestant. It's a fine distinction, but sometimes the slight distinctions matter more than the bigger distinctions. I think that the clash of civilizations, in addition to the factual problem, of that it doesn't quite fit the facts, there's a conceptual problem, and I would label it cultural essentialism. That Huntington's worldview is that every Islamic person, whether they're Moroccan or Indonesian, whether they're a black Muslim in Chicago or a Huiyao, a resident of Xi'an, that they have the same worldview, and that's the same worldview that 500 years ago was involved in the conflicts with the Crusaders. And I think that's really just a fallacy. It's a tempting fallacy. There's part of us that wants to believe that we are exactly the same as our ancestors, and that every member of the West thinks the same way I do. It's the tribal instincts that I write about in my book, pull us in the direction of that, but it's not the rational way to understand things. It's not true, and it doesn't show you the power that you have when you understand culture in a more complex way. The more complex way that I talk about in the book Tribal is that tribal living from the very beginning has been living within nested communities, right? So even the hunter-gatherer forebears, they lived in a band that hunted and slept together, and then that band was part of a clan, and then that clan became part of a tribe, a broader network, within a region. And so, there were different identities that were nested within each other. And of course, in the modern world, we have organizational cultures, we have the cultures of our professions, we have the cultures of, informal social networks that we belong to, that we get our news from. And then we have the cultures of our nations, and we have the cultures of, regions of the world that share a common history. But there's a multiplicity of identities inside every person. And that's important to understand. The clash of civilization idea, at least in the US, it became very popular after 9/11 because, people were shocked by this, looking for a simple explanation. And the idea that there was some, timeless Muslim rage, against the West that had resurfaced was a tempting way to think. But if you really look at that event, if you really read Osama bin Laden's writings or the ideology of Al-Qaeda, the whole point of Al-Qaeda was that they knew that Islamic countries were divided between moderate Islam and radical Islam. And what they wanted to do was attack the West in such a provocative way that there would be a disproportional and brutal response. And then that brutal response would move people from moderate Islam into radical Islam. That was the actual strategy that was written out in great detail to kind of collapse the divide between moderate Islam and radical Islam. And even today, if you look at, say, the strategy of Hamas, what were they trying to accomplish on October 7th? They were trying to incur a disproportionate response that would, turn a generation away from moderation, towards, radical opposition to Israel. So if we can understand cultures in the more accurate way, that there are divides within every nation and, that every person has multiple ties that are pulling on them, we can understand conflicts better than if we think that all conflicts are, the West versus Islam, or, I can't even remember what the 7 categories were in Huntington's in writing. But so I think that, understanding tribal instincts can both help us understand why people are drawn to this essentialistic way of thinking about culture, but it can help us understand that that's not really an accurate way to understand culture, that culture consists of nested groups and overlapping groups, and that there's a lot of potential as a leader to harness the different cultural identities that people have to lead change. And that's what the book is about. It's a playbook for leaders in politics and in business who want to harness the cultural forces and cultural loyalties in people.
Excellent, fascinating. I mean, Michael, what you have outlined there is really something very significant. I think absolutely, particularly in this turbulent time in a global arena. You are right. Samuel Huntington's clash of civilization, as if we are all doomed, because we have a few big civilization. But now you are drawing more fundamentally, as early as far as deep as tribes, and instant. We do have human beings have instant, and we really can follow the how this can impact, whether it's peers or it's ancestors or it's heroes, you have all those combined, and then you can really find a way to change the world, basically, if we can really harmonize them, right? Using the Chinese word harmonizing. And then so that is really pointed a new analytical framework, actually, for me at least, to see this new global phenomena. And we don't have to be so pessimistic because we have a different civilization. But now we do, have tools, have another outlook to look at those things. So this is really, I found this stimulating and encouraging that we actually, have to study the differences. We have to really find the common denominators, find the, common thread that we can really, put them, glue them together. So this is really great. And so in this, in your very interesting argument, I really find that interesting, is that in this, we are getting a really major power rivalry play, like of course China, U.S., and now even EU, and now Russia, and all those things. So how can we really, to what extent can competition, confrontation be seen as amplified tribal instinct at work? And how does the tribal instinct profoundly shape the identification with our own nation and our own attitudes, behaviors towards other nations? So we, as if all those countries, there are 200 countries in the world, does that mean we have 200 tribes? Or what are we, or even China has 31 provinces, do we have 31 tribes? So how do we really define and apply that to the modern world? I mean, that's something we would like to hear from you.
Well, it's a great question, and I come at this as a research psychologist, as a behavioral scientist, trying to understand what are the deepest parts of human nature that contribute to the way that we live in cultures, the way that we live in tribes. And, tribe in its most basic meaning is, it's the human form of social life, which means living in large communities that are bound together by a common idea, whether that common idea is loyalty to a nation, whether that common idea is a constitution, or it can be a culture that is bound together based on the love of a certain kind of music or a certain kind of hobby. So there's all kinds of tribes that people live in. I think that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of tribes, within China, as there always have been. One of my friends, Chiu Chu, he found a sort of anthology of Chinese proverbs that recorded which part of China the proverb was first associated with. And even though these proverbs were, thousands of years old, he was able to show that there were clusters of different ideas, in different provinces of China. So the eternal wisdom of China is not one thing, it's many strands, right? Many strands. The north of China is different from the south of China. People grow different crops and live in different patterns. So there's always been pluralism within our countries, but it is the case that our governments, and I would say that my country and your country right now both have strong leaders who find it advantageous to promote nationalism, right? To promote national identification. And there's nothing inherently wrong with it, right? I mean, it helps a nation function if people identify strongly with the nation as opposed to, with their local province or with broader international regions, right? So there's not necessarily something bad about nationalism, but what happens with nationalism is that other nations are sometimes used as a foil, So when Donald Trump is trying to sharpen people's sense of what it means to be an American, he will contrast the U.S. with Europeans, who we're related to, right? That's where a lot of us came from. But Europeans are these decadent, bloodless, people who have nothing in common. Trump's mother was Scottish, but he draws these exaggerated lines, between the in-group and the out-group. And then that's not harmless because it reduces empathy for the out group, and it reduces perspective taking and the ability to collaborate effectively. And our greatest allies have always been in Europe, and even Canada is like, for Trump, too far away, and I know you have some history in Canada, but it's amazing. I always think of Canadians as the politest people on earth, but Trump will say they're nasty people, and I'm like, who are you talking about? They're polite to a fault, So and I think that whether it's whipping the flames of nationalism, or it's a CEO trying to create, more company spirit, or it's a university trying to, get the students to be more identified with the university. There are some basic levers that leaders pull to sort of activate or strengthen an identity. And in my book, I go through them because it's the kind of thing that I and the many other behavioral scientists who have been working on culture for the last couple of decades, we've been studying this, and we've found that somebody's culture is not like a fixed worldview that is always affecting them to the same extent. It's much more dynamic. It turns on and turns off, and it also can be changed over time, by the signals that leaders send. So I think that, both in China and the US, you see our leaders sending those signals, and I can go into more detail about that. But I think that tribal psychology is very relevant to the resurgent nationalism, because the resurgent nationalism is happening because people are exploiting tribal psychology. They're using the levers of tribal psychology to make people more nationalistic.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Certainly, it's true. We recognize that. As a matter of fact, the Canadian Prime Minister is in town in Beijing visiting.
Okay.
China. Yeah, and absolutely. I think for President Trump, this MAGA, kind of approach, was that probably also explore some of the tribal or some instant of U.S. or whatever, but also at the same time he's bashing his anti-attack some European heritage or historical background that he
Yeah.
So he's very skillful using those differentiation perspectives to
Very
to
much.
his advantage.
Yeah, MAGA, Make America Great Again,
Yeah.
is classic, divisive populism, where you paint a picture of past generations as being less diverse. He paints a picture that the US, in the past was a white Christian English-speaking nation. But that's completely false. If you look at the Revolutionary War, Native Americans died, African Americans died, Muslims died. There have been, since at that time in the U.S., in Louisiana, they spoke French, as they did in parts of Vermont. In Ohio, they spoke German. So there have been many religions, many ethnic groups, and many languages in our country from the beginning. But it's not the case that tribal the levers of tribalism always have to be divisive. In the book, I talk a lot about some of our presidents, like President Lincoln, who inherited a very divided nation, but he used strategies similar to MAGA to bring people together. One of the things that he did was he more or less invented the national holiday of Thanksgiving, which looks back to the Pilgrims and looks back to George Washington, to make people, in the South and the North feel like they had common ancestors, and that it's always been a ritual for those ancestors to meet different kinds of people and share a banquet with them. So it was a very effective way of creating a retrospective history that wasn't completely accurate, but that served the purpose of bringing people together. And I think probably in China, there's a certain effort to make it sound like, for 3,000 years, exclusively Han people have lived in exactly the same way that we live today. And that kind of creates a good feeling, right? But it's not really accurate. Like if you have a real historian go back, they'll say, well, no, there were different groups, and they're not, we're not exactly the same as our forebears.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a gradual, evolution process. I noticed your early class research with Professor Peng Kai-ping on East-West attribution differences precisely reviews that deep-seated differences in thinking cycles. And so today, in the Sino-US relations and border cross-civilization dialogues, both sides often seem to fall into misjudge each other's intentions. And we know that President Trump may come to Beijing in April, and that could probably President Xi is going to revisit the U.S. in sometime in this year. And then they're going to come again for APEC summit in November. And we may go back again, President of China, for the G20. So they're going to have a 4 times differences. But how can we really use those tools, as you outlined, to really diffuse those misunderstandings and really promote a common ground for those country-to-country relations?
Well, I'm very impressed at your knowledge of these studies that I did decades ago. Peng Kai-ping and I we were 2 students, both of us a little bit lost, and we both were very curious about cultural differences, and so we started working in a way that has become this field, cultural psychology. And what we were trying to do was understand the worldviews or the cultural lenses that were behind the way that, that when I would interpret something, it would often be different from what Kai-ping would interpret, from the same event. And so we were working with our own experiences and our countries to try to understand what those cultural lenses or worldviews are. And essentially what we came up with was quite similar to what a Chinese anthropologist, Francis Xu, had written about, decades before, based on his field work and his living, in China and living in the West for many decades. And that was the idea that, in individualistic Western cultures, there's a very person-centered view of society. We think the essential state of the individual is to be alone, and any kind of relationship or group membership is kind of an imposition, and we are most ourselves when we're alone. And if you want to understand anything, you have to look at the individual persons and make inferences about the traits of those persons, like what's their personality, or what do they care about, or are they smart or not smart? And so that's the very American style of making sense of events. It's a very personalistic, characterological style. And I think, you can see this when you see some American leaders, like, for example, President Trump. He goes to North Korea and he forms, very personal impressions of the leader, and then his interpretation of the country is very, very rooted in his concept of this person's personality. He always seems to be very impressed with Xi Jinping, I think, because Trump is very taken by people who are handsome and who look like soldiers. Xi Jinping is, tall, and, he stands very strong and he's confident. And so Trump always seems to be very impressed by Xi Jinping when they meet in person. But I think that what I would have to say is that, there's more hope in cultural psychology now than when Kai-ping and I were doing this. We thought these worldviews were relatively fixed, so we had, more of like a Huntingdonian view at that time. But in the decades since, we've realized that these cultural lenses are not constantly on, because, if I may, I would use you as an example, President Wang. You lived and studied in Canada for decades, so undoubtedly you have a Canadian identity and you understand the Canadian worldview, but you also have your Chinese identity and you understand the Chinese worldview, and you probably even know the difference between the US worldview and the Canadian worldview. But which of those worldviews is going to be operative depends a lot on your immediate setting or who you're talking to, the audience in front of you. In the US in the last decade or so, we've started talking about this as code switching, which is an old idea from linguistics that sort of polyglots will switch between languages based on the audience in front of them. So I think that there's a lot of hope in the idea of code switching because, even let's take Xi Jinping, for example. He, in the past, when he was a agricultural, minister, he went and lived in Iowa and lived with a farmer's family, for a period of time. And in 2023, when he was in the US, he went back to Iowa and had a dinner with his old friends from Iowa. And so to me, that's really encouraging that, the leaders of our countries are bicultural at some level, and they have the capacity to see things the American way. They won't always do that. They will see things the Chinese way most of the time, as they should. But I think that we want to promote cross-cultural understanding and intercultural experiences because it allows for a kind of perspective taking that otherwise is not possible.
Okay, great. Michael, I think you're right talking about these differences in thinking styles between East and West. Peng Kaiping actually launched the book at the CCG a few years ago, so I know he's been very active in talking those psychological differences as well between East and West. But I'm thinking, like you said, the U.S. and the Western countries are more individualistic, right? And then China is more collectivism. Maybe that's probably thousands of years of history like that. For example, in the old days, China is a vast country, and then you have to do the irrigations, you have to mobilize the people to prevent floods, and then it's highly centralized system, and then so the collectivism is really needed. But on top of that, for the last 7 decades, China is the most populous country in the world, and today it still has 1.4 billion people. Only India recently catched up. So, do you think that the collectivism, in terms of a governing style in China, and a collectivism, and also basically Confucius have some kind of values in preaching that, and that's versus individualistic. Of course, we can see who is better, who is not. But does that really apply to a country that have specific conditions? Like China is big, China has a culture, China has history. So sometimes this collectivism works here. But of course, there's also a lot of freedom. The market economy is basically about, enterprises, individualism as well. So probably China is a hybrid now. It may be more combined. That's why China made a lot of progress. It made a miracle. Do you think what attributes to China's success in terms of, at least in the last 4 decades, become the second largest economy in the world? What are the key success factors that from psychological analysis point of view?
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say that, the people in the US often talk about the rise of China. And I always say, what you mean is the return of China, because for most of the last 3,000 years, China was the most populous country in the world and the largest economy. It's only been in the last 200, 300 years that, Rome fell and the Han Dynasty didn't fall. But, in the last 200, 300 years, China went through some troubles, largely thanks to, Western countries. But I think that, so the collectivism and a lot of the ideas that are part of the Confucian heritage undoubtedly contribute to the success, not just in the recent decades, but the success 500 years ago and 1,000 years ago in China. I think that China is an interesting case. Not all collectivist countries are the same. And it's also the case, I would push back, that China is internally diverse, so the stereotype of like rice paddy agriculture leading to collectivism, that applies to the south of China. But the north of China is wheat growing, and you didn't have that pressure to collaborate closely with your neighbors. And the north of China is far more individualistic, if you look at surveys, and of course, when you go to the far west of China, then there are even more differences, because people live in different ecologies and there are different heritages, that are more prominent there. So I think that China is diverse. China has taken a lot of lessons from the West. Even Marxism, was a kind of Western idea that China took and adapted. So I think that just like people say, why is the United States successful? Well, it's successful because we've been open to immigration from, we've taken the best and the brightest from every country, including China, for decades and decades. And that's been the secret of our success, just openness to the world, not any inherent genius. We're not a very intellectual country. So I think that China also is open in its own way. And it's a country with a very strong achievement orientation. And that doesn't always go along with collectivism. But, China is very strong on achievement values. So, people are, and there's always been social mobility in China. It in the past came through the imperial exam situation. And I think, you still have the Gaokao, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, the exam. And so that's I think a mechanism of social mobility is very important for sustained success. Otherwise, you have a decadent aristocracy that is not productive, and you have collapses.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Michael, you're precisely on. I think that Gaokao is absolutely a good example. I'm the first batch of student enrolled in the Gaokao after Cultural Revolution.
Okay.
Yeah, so 10 years there's no Gaokao. So then, luckily we had that Deng Xiaoping restore the Gaokao, so we all get a chance to go to university.
And did you find textbooks and study on your own and then pass the test? Is that how you?
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
You're right. I was in the rural area, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
I was sent down youth at that time. So
I recently had dinner with a friend, Xia Lin Xia at University of Toronto. I don't know if you've ever met her, but I know that you've spent some time in Ontario, but she's of your generation as well, so she came back from, working in the countryside and then had the opportunity to study on her own and do well enough to get into college. So it's your generation lived. When we talk about cultural change, your generation lived it.
We went through many changes, obviously, from very scarcity society to abundant society now. But one of the things I think absolutely related to Gaokao is this in China is a meritocracy. That's practiced for thousands of years. That's even now, for example, you see in China these days, every year there's about 15-16 million people went to Gaokao, but then 30 million has been admitted into the system. And then then they're going to have 3.5 million even more to chase for these 200,000 government positions at different levels. So that system has been there for a long time. And also the official promotion. You have to start from village, county, and then municipality, province, and then rise to the center top position. So you have to perform exactly a number of years at each place. So if you have a government in Korea, you have to count it how fast you can go. So that probably explains some of the success on China is this talent, promotion, talent selection, and meritocracy into the system. The bureaucratic system, the officials are very experienced. I agree also with you that U.S. is the best taker of a global talent. They have the cream of the cream, and then that's one of the key success of the U.S.
Yes.
China, the meritocracy as the success factor of China, one of the key success factor. But taking global talent by the U.S. is the U.S. key success factor.
And I know you've been a leader in China with trying to promote having foreigners come to China and build their career there, right? Because why shouldn't China steal some talent after giving the world so much talent for so long, right?
That's right.
It's
Yeah,
only fair.
exactly. We had, since the open up, China had about 8 million students went abroad, probably over 1 million probably stayed in the U.S. So we actually, needs to also attract global talents as well. So that is really interesting topic. But coming back to your analysis of American cognitive tribalism, in the book is very interesting and point out its roots into isolated information cocoons and divided perception of the facts. So is this a common psychological mechanism for waves of populism and political polarization observed globally now? Because we have a populism, nationalism, we have a rightist government rising in many countries, and so how does that cognitive tribalism explain that?
Well, I guess there's a lot of questions there. How do we explain the rise of populism around the world? The rise of right-wing populism. That's definitely been a trend of the last decades. I think one way that tribalism can offer some explanation for that is that our tribal instincts, I think, are generally adaptive. They enable us to live in these large communities, these large networks, these large organizations, and they allow us to benefit from the economies of scale and the deep knowledge pool that we can tap into when we're part of these large communities. But each of the tribal instincts can cycle out of control. Each of the tribal instincts can lead to dysfunctional ways of thinking that produce conflicts, especially when social conditions change relatively quickly. And so when we see, it's become a sort of trope for the pundits in the United States to talk about toxic tribalism and to blame a lot of the problems in the world on tribalism, whether it's, the red tribe and the blue tribe not being able to cooperate in American politics, or it's, conflict between ethnic groups, in the United States, or, wars in the Middle East. And I think that, tribalism itself tribal instincts are not inherently bad. They are not what the pundits paint them as. The pundits talk about tribalism as though it's a hardwired instinct to hate outsiders. And to behavioral scientists or to evolutionary scientists, that makes no sense at all. The tribal instincts are instincts for solidarity, instincts that enabled us to live in these larger communities. And it's only when these solidarity instincts cycle out of control that they lead to a kind of conflict. And they cycle out of control, they kind of get into feedback loops when social conditions change. So one of the changed social conditions in the last generation is what we call globalization, which is that there's been an acceleration of the movement of ideas and products and people and capital, across national boundaries. It's not like it started, after the Cold War fell. Like ancient Rome was an example of globalization, right? There's, ancient Xi'an was an example of globalization, right? There's always been cosmopolitanism. There's always been travelers. There's always been curiosity about other countries, but it accelerated due to changes in information technology and changes in transportation technologies, so that it became almost as easy for somebody, in Ethiopia. It used to be if they immigrated, maybe they would go to Eritrea next door, but now they can go to Sweden almost as easily. And so globalization has led to immigrant populations in a lot of countries where the immigrants are really different from the the mainstream host culture group. It used to be that Sweden's largest sources of immigration were Norway and Finland, and Denmark, not very different, right? Other Scandinavian Protestant people, but now the largest sources of immigrants in Sweden are, I think, Syria and, maybe Afghanistan, in recent years. So you get people who differ on many, many dimensions, living side by side. And that leads to some, frequent misunderstandings and conflicts, and the majority group becomes very vulnerable to right-wing populist politicians who would say, look, these immigrants have ruined our quality of life. Sweden no longer resembles Sweden because, we have, more children named Mohammed than children named, Sven, something like that. And I think that, that's an example of where tribal instincts then become, I would say dysfunctional, because I think that countries like Sweden have labor shortages. They're taking these immigrants for a reason. They don't always expect that the first generation of immigrants are immediately going to assimilate, but they know that their children will grow up and be relatively Swedish. They will be fluent Swedish speakers. They will be working in bakeries. They will be cab drivers. They will be, doing all the jobs that need to be filled in Sweden. So I think that, at least in my view, I regard this right-wing populism as a simplistic way of thinking, a kind of easy way of thinking that we are tempted towards sometimes. But it usually comes from a sort of superficial read on what the cause of the problems are. And globalization has created this new problem, which is, minority populations that are very different from the mainstream population. And the rise of right-wing populism, I think, is a side effect of that. If you look in Europe, after I can't remember which, was it the year 2015 when there were more refugees going to Europe than there were refugees after World War II. It was a huge shock. And to countries like Germany or the Netherlands. There's been a cultural blowback in response to that sudden wave of immigration.
Yes, absolutely. I think the current world, of course, the rise of populism, nationalism, is also attributes to there's a widening gap, between probably rich and poor, and also there's some. Also domestically, there's a lot of needs has not been taken, and there's too much conflict probably sometimes on the regional front, so that politicians can really take advantage of that. But also furthermore, I think there's also the international competition probably also attributes to some advantage and disadvantages as well. So that's a very interesting phenomenon. I think we need to look, but of course can use the tribal analytical framework to really find out what are the differences, what are the similarities, and then try to minimize the differences.
But I would say again that tribal psychology can be exploited by politicians for division, but the same exact social conditions can be construed for populism. So in New York City now, we have a new mayor, Zoran Mamdani, and he became elected by assembling a coalition mostly of new immigrant, a big part of his constituency are immigrants. New York City has always been a city of immigrants. It's always the case that, the majority of Manhattan residents were not born in the United States. Sometimes New Yorkers call New York the capital of a country that doesn't exist, because we feel that there's a character of New York that's quite different from the character of most of the United States, in part because of this immigrant dynamism. But Mamdani created a coalition around the issue of affordability, which, touches a lot of those recent immigrants, people who are, a lot of people move to New York. They're sending money home to their family. They're driving a cab. They have a food cart, or they're working as a waiter. And it's, the price of the bus fares and things like that may seem like trivial issues to a lot of New Yorkers, but they're not trivial to somebody on a tight monthly budget, trying to, make enough money to send home or to, put their kids through school. So he assembled a coalition around this issue of affordability that, brings together a lot of the Muslim population, but also, the progressive Jewish population and a lot of the African immigrants. So he also grew up partially in Africa. So he kind of used his multicultural upbringing, to connect strategically with South Asians, Middle Easterners, Africans, showing through his cultural familiarity with different neighborhood groups that he was one of them. And there's a precedent for this, which I think is a really important one, which is everybody knows, one of the airports in New York is called LaGuardia Airport.
Yeah.
And that is in honor of Fiorello LaGuardia, who was probably the most successful New York mayor. A lot of people say New York is ungovernable, but LaGuardia also put together a coalition of working class immigrants that cut across the lines of religion and revolved around issues that were that some people at the time called socialist, even though he was a Republican. Like, he had the idea that that the electric power maybe should be a public utility, not relying on a private company that might, decide to close down the power in the middle of the winter. And of course, now we consider that obvious, but, that was considered to be dangerous socialism at the time. But Fiorello LaGuardia, thought of it as, necessary for taking care of the people that he was trying to take care of. So I think I'm very confident that Mamdani is going to be a better mayor than our most recent mayor, who was overtly corrupt, and probably a better mayor than the mayor before that, who was a little bit passive and disorganized. So if he runs his mayoralty with anything like the degree of focus that he ran his campaign with, he will become a legendary figure in American politics. And I think it was also very interesting that he was able to charm Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump had been calling him all of the worst names possible. When he got there in person, he said, Mr. Trump, you ran a campaign talking about affordability. I did the same thing. We care about the same cause. He somehow brought Trump into his coalition in a few minutes, and that was a pretty impressive example of his political skills.
Yes, that's right. He's very, very impressive. That reminds me now, and New York, of course, is a largely immigrant city. His success has been mobilizing all the aspects, and his instincts, and also all the tribes' characters. He's taking into consideration. But again, one question I'd like to ask is that, you see now President Trump, we had this New Year surprise on January 3rd or something. He stormed the presidential palace of Venezuela and take the Maduro to New York. And so do you think that he could really, like the elected New York mayor, he can mobilize Latin American countries by having a coalition with all the South American, or maybe alienated, the 60 million Latino voters in the U.S., which are going to, maybe make a comeback? And so what do you think about this kind of behavior, that he really, acted very strongly, very differently, and made the world by surprise? So would he be able to consolidate Americas, have a United States of the Western Hemisphere, or maybe he's not, this video is talking about Greenland, but do you think that this talking about New York mayor's example, would this 50, 60 million Latino voters voting next time or not. And so depends how he's going to do. I know Rubio is from Cuba, from Spanish
Cuban family, yeah.
Representing. He visited, his first visit is to Latin American countries. So how do you assess this kind of situation?
Well, I would start by saying that I think, President Wang, you're thinking more steps ahead than I think our administration is thinking. I think that they can be very reactive, and apparently Trump was very swayed by a video that Maduro posted on social media of himself dancing and saying, "Come and get me," or something like that. And apparently that actually, affected the decision making. I don't know. That's what we read in the news. Trump did benefit in this last election by the Hispanic, more Hispanic men voted for Trump than for Biden, and so, the hot take after this election when Trump was elected was that, oh, the white males, who've been left out in the era of diversity and wokeness, rebelled and put Trump into power. But, the rate of voting for Trump among Hispanic men was extremely high. And I think that partially, Trump, portrayed himself as this strong, vital person and portrayed Biden as this sick old man. And I think that resonated with a lot of men. Maybe it shouldn't have, but it did. So, but the polls in recent months show that the Hispanic vote may not be going with Trump next time. There's a number of policies that Trump has, promoted that, are not working in favor of the Hispanic population. And, when people see their cousins and neighbors being dragged off by ICE, the sort of paramilitary, immigration authorities that we have now, which are very frightening to most Americans because it sure looks like fascism. It's a hallmark of fascism where you have this, blending of military and police, and people who seem to be directly reporting to the president as opposed to, the other channels, the division of powers, which is such an important idea in our democracy. So you are correct that the Hispanic vote is not a lock for Trump. And then the question is, Maduro in New York, how will the many Hispanic New Yorkers react to that? And one thing that you mentioned when you wrote me earlier was the story in my book about Gustavo Dudamel, who is a Venezuelan composer who was recruited at a very young age by the Los Angeles Philharmonic because they knew that classical music in the US was dying, that young people were not coming. And so they thought, okay, here's this supremely talented Latino composer. Why don't we make him music director, and then he can reinvigorate, the classical music scene in Los Angeles. And that's exactly what he did. And the Los Angeles Philharmonic has been the most interesting center of classical music in the United States during the time that he's been there. But now the New York Philharmonic, which is suffering because it's the average age of its season's ticket holders is like 75 years old, which is not a good demographic, for the future. So they have hired him away. So we in New York are going to have our symphony, suddenly directed by this very dynamic young Venezuelan sort of rock star composer. But we're also going to be trying Maduro, from the same generation, so Venezuela is going to be in the news a lot more than it has been in the past. I think that the crisis in Venezuela has been a problem for the U.S. in recent years because we have a really, just like it's been a problem for Colombia, beforehand, that just, the large swaths of the professional middle class of Venezuela, which was a formerly very wealthy nation, you know, felt unsafe, and then they had to be refugees and work as cab drivers and waiters, in Colombia. And then a wave has come to the United States, and in every city there is a large budget line in the city budget is accommodating the refugees, and so it's really weighed on cities like New York and Chicago, et cetera. So I think there is some eagerness to try to help resolve the crisis in Venezuela, but I don't think that kidnapping the leader of state was a wise idea. I don't think it was legal. It's not consistent with U.S. foreign policy in the last 100 years. But Trump, using his tribalistic playbook, he's suddenly invoking the Monroe Doctrine, and he calls it's sometimes called the Donroe Doctrine now because it's Donald Trump, which is a really old-fashioned way of thinking that the U.S. should be able to meddle in the countries in our backyard, and then presumably China should be able to meddle anywhere in Asia, and Russia should be allowed to meddle in Ukraine. And that's not a modern idea. The modern idea post World War II is that there's national autonomy, and that you don't violate the autonomy, you don't violate the sovereignty of nation states. And so, yeah, it's very troubling for people like myself who, think that, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a horrible human tragedy. And you can imagine that for someone like President Putin, this would embolden him, right? If the U.S. is suddenly kidnapping heads of state and invading countries without a clear reason, a clear rationale, then why should Putin worry that Russia will be a pariah among nations?
Okay. Yes. Probably one of the last question I'd like to ask is that, these days we see the technology is really reshaping the form of tribes, agramaticism, and also shape the digital tribes bounded by emotions and identity, and often exert influence beyond the geography and nation state. So does this actually fundamentally change somehow, or even deconstruct the modern national identity based on territory or sovereignty? How should we manage this risk of social fragmentation and extremism brought about it by digital tribulation? And also on top of that, we have AI, we have robots, we have all those existing risks that beyond the borders and transcend the borders. And so the community with how can we really, if with all those things have a community of shared future? I mean, how can we really come to that kind of a common understanding and then build up some consensus with those technological challenges?
It's a really important issue. I think that in the United States right now, social media has been devastating. It has been devastating, to the mental health of our adolescents, because they engage in social comparison, looking at pictures of their peers that have been through filters, and so they have terrible body image, terrible self-esteem, terrible social anxiety. But it's also eroded the national conversation. We used to be able to have nuanced conversations where we would, try to find compromise between, Republican principles and Democratic principles, and try to find policies that would find bipartisan support. And, bipartisan bills in Congress hardly ever happen anymore. And ordinary people have started to think about, the red tribe and the blue tribe, the Democrats and the Republicans and the Democrats, as these almost like the way people used to think about races, as these defining identities, and people are now more worried. Democrats are more worried about their children marrying someone who's a Republican than they are about, marrying somebody, of the same gender, or marrying somebody of a different race, the things that were taboo in the past. And so I think social media has had this effect. Lately, the last few months since my book came out in China, I've been on Xiaohongshu and Bilibili, and I've been getting to know the Chinese social media. And the discourse doesn't seem to be as acrimonious, as it is on, say, X, the former Twitter, where you just have people castigating each other, wanting to dunk on each other. And one thing that you see a lot of is what we call virtue signaling, where if I'm a Democrat and I want to, gain prestige within my blue tribe, I wait until Donald Trump says something, offensive, and then I link to it and I post, this man is not human. He is blah, blah, blah. He's thinking like an animal or something, very just outrageous, outrageously rejecting what he has said with a lot of moral outrage and venom. And then I get showered with likes, from the other Democrats who the post goes to. And of course, the post doesn't really go to the Republicans, so I don't hear from them about it. And people have become addicted to this virtue signaling, of making these really extreme expressions of moral outrage. It used to be that if you wanted to do this, you would have to go to a political demonstration in person and push yourself to the front lines and shout in the face of the other groups, and you might get shoved, So, but now we can do virtue signaling without any risk and reaching a much wider audience. So people have become addicted to it, and so it's an example where this age-old tribal instinct, what I call in the book the hero instinct, the desire for status within your community, it's been hijacked, by this new social condition of social media, and it's leading to a very dysfunctional polarization. So then the harder question is, what can we do about it? I think that some of it has to do with the legal frameworks. In the U.S., when online news platforms first came out in the era of Yahoo and Google, in the late 90s, they were legally categorized as like a newsstand, not like a magazine. So they are not liable for misinformation in the way that, say, the New York Times is liable. And I think that maybe that was a defensible legal standard in the old days when these platforms were relatively passive. But since then, these platforms have become much more active shapers of which information gets to which people. And like these virtue signaling expressions of moral outrage are they reach much larger audiences than moderate, calm political statements, and they get retweeted a lot more. They get reposted a lot more. So people have a disproportionate picture of the opinion spectrum. They see the opinions from the extremes, but not from the center. So I think we need to change our regulatory standard, and that in our country, that has to happen through lawsuits that make their way to the Supreme Court and that, reclassify social media platforms so that they are more liable for the quality of the information that they are pumping out. And when the incentives on them change, they will change. There's nothing inherent about the technology that causes people to polarize. It's just that it's very lucrative for the technology platforms to emphasize this kind of content that has kind of destroyed our political conversation. So I think we need to, I think in China, you have different legal platforms, and social media may not be having this toxic effect, but in the US it has been. And now AI is new to the scene, and my hope is that AI will destroy social media, because social media otherwise seems to have a lock on people's minds. And there's some evidence that AI can be effective at helping people get out of conspiracy theories, and helping people depolarize. Because when you're having a conversation with AI, you don't think that you're either talking to a red tribe member or a blue tribe member. You know that you're just talking to a machine. And so people who have conversations with AI tend to become less extreme in their views. At least contemporary AI has that effect. Hopefully, we won't see the same problem that once a technology becomes widely platformed, then the technology changes in ways to make it profitable, even though those changes are harmful for people. So hopefully we won't see that same change that happened, to other kinds of social media in the past.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Michael. Actually, you're right. We have seen this expose of social media, and now AI, now all those swarmed our mobile phones and everything we read and hear now. But you're absolutely right. I think the regulatories and then the governing standards, and then we probably have to come up with that. Otherwise, as you said, is more they hide behind the scene. Talk whatever you want to talk. Bring out the bad instinct of the people sometimes. And then
Yes.
if that is not really contained or managed to some extent, we're going to see a world probably destroyed by our own technology and advancement. So this is probably to come to our last question and discussion. I know that you also, during our communication, you were asking, what would I choose for word for the the Chinese wisdom help the world understand how to navigate the tribal instinct.
Yes.
So what would I choose, and how that is point to our shared future? Basically, you talked about a lot about this tribal instinct, and it's an inescapable part of the human nature. This era is filled with different forces and divided forces as well. So what I'm thinking now is that you talk a lot about instinct and talk about tribal characteristics and how we can make good use of it, make better use of it. And if I'm thinking of any Chinese term for that, or some instinct of nature or family values for that, I really think that there's a saying in China saying that the universe is a family. 天下一家,
Okay.
Basically, yeah. So the universe is a family. So the family value, basically attaches great importance into our society. And I remember the former U.S. ambassador, Terry Breinstein. He was here for a few years, but when he left China, he organized the reception. He was saying at the reception, saying, look, he spent 3 years in China. The 3 most important things impressed him, that he characterized as 3 very distinct characters of Chinese. First is family values, and second is the education that attaches to the culture in China, and thirdly is the hardworking, very hardworking, 724 sometimes. So I think human beings' nature, or human beings' instinct, family is universal probably. No matter where you are, you American, Chinese, African, or Europeans, they're all coming from their families. They have a parent. So that kind of universal instinct, universal value, and then can we really have a more emphasis on that and maybe find more common denominators, because that is the language you understand everywhere, and then people appreciate it everywhere. So that if we treat the world as a family, if we treat the universe as a family, maybe we could say, okay, we are all brothers and sisters. We all have one nose, two eyes, and 2 ears. We are all the same. So that probably, but also we care our babies, and we care our parents. We love each other, right? So that probably would be if I would choose a universal instinct that can really ring the bell to everyone on this planet. Maybe this family values and family tradition and things like that could be really interesting. So I don't know what's your concluding remarks for our dialogue, and what do you think, because of this nature and instinct and everything, that we can have a better world, have a better future for shared mankind, have this kind of a learning experience of each other, or tradition of emphasize, and this kind of human beings' basic instinct, how we can maximize that. The good instinct, of course, care of each other, love each other, and stick strongly to the family values.
Well, one definition of tribe is family beyond family, right? It's because, you have this connection to the other, you have this trust with the fellow members of your tribe, no matter what kind of tribe it is. And that ultimately the prototype for that is family. And I think that's the genius of Confucian philosophy, that the basic family relationships are the prototype for thinking about the rest of society. You honor your parents, you should also honor your teacher, you should also honor the emperor, and so I think that that's a very wise way of understanding that these larger groups, like a society, are rooted in the fundamental instincts, that come from the smallest group, the family. And I think that one thing that I like about when I spend time in China, and I have many old friends, like Peng Kai-ping and many others, that when I meet their children, they all always say, "You remember Uncle Michael, right?" And I lived in Singapore a couple of years ago for a year, and there they take it really far. Everybody is an uncle or an auntie, every person working at a restaurant is, hello, auntie, hello, uncle, hello, So, anthropologists call this fictive kin, of familiarizing people, making somebody like family. And I think that's a part of Chinese culture that I think is really wonderful, that you have this capacity to first understand family, but also to bring in a stranger as though they are a family member. And I think that the hope for international comity, the hope for international growth and respect, comes from that. We need to keep telling young people to go study in other countries. We need to have people go live in other countries and work there and become part of families, become part, like Xi Jinping did in Iowa, right? He lived with a family. And so that's the best thing we can hope for, I think, in terms of not just understanding at a cognitive level how we differ, but, feeling connected, feeling that connection of the heart to people, even though they may live on a different side of the world.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Morris. I think you're getting late there now, and it was a fascinating discussion, and we really enjoyed that. We have also many think tank researchers and media, also friends here in this room, but we're going to have a lot of online as well. So I really want to thank you for taking your time out of your big day, but also we want to thank CITIC Press, also our audience here, and also our audience online. And we'd love to welcome you back next time. We could another.
Well, I wish I could be there in person and talk to everyone in the room about their questions and about their interests. I'm fascinated by China, and I really wanted my book to have a Chinese edition because I feel like, the largest pool of educated, curious, well-meaning people is in China. That's the largest pool on earth of people that I want to reach with this book.
That's true. We have 250 million college graduates among our population, so it is about the largest. And
Yeah, I mean that's all. You have as many college graduates as we have people.
That's right. Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you, Michael, very much, and we really hope to keep in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a real honor to talk to you.
Okay, great. Thank you.